Could I just have a quick show of hands? Who in the room would say they were involved in some way in containerized shipping by sea freight? Just so I know where to pitch this. Okay. Jolly good. Right. Well, hopefully those people with their hands up will know some of this, but to the rest of you, and indeed maybe to some of those people, my plan today is to explain to you some of the behaviours you see from shipping lines and why they do some things that the outside world might think are crazy, and what impact that therefore would have on the logistics chain in general, but also specifically in the UK when you think at a local level. So in order to do that, I'm sort of going to sprinkle a few ideas onto the table, and I'm going to talk about what are the fundamental economic drivers for a shipping company. And you'll see the relevance of that as I go through it, because that, as I say, drives a number of other things. The global trends that are particularly impacting that are fuel cost, which in various ways is leading to changes. You're seeing increasing ship sizes, and you're seeing a lot of development of alliances within the container shipping world. All of those sort of things hang together, and I'll explain how that works. And finally, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on the role of IT in this. Some of it's already been said. What you presented on that slide is certainly true. And environmental considerations that have also been touched on, certainly this morning, in terms of how that might or might not change things. So, if we look at a quick toy town introduction to container shipping economics. This is true for any business, but profitability is obviously determined by the balance between costs and revenues. And there are two particular elements within container shipping that influence these two factors. And the two variables that I'd like to talk about are the supply and demand balance, and which is the main driver of the revenue line, and the cost of fuel, which is one of the main elements of costs in shipping, and therefore, again, drives an awful lot of behaviour. Now, with my best use of clip art, I'm going to talk about the supply-demand balance. So the number and capacity of new ships in the container shipping world has far surpassed the number and capacity of the ships that have been scrapped. So over the last 10, 12 years, there has been a massive growth in the number and volume that is of ships, number of ships, and the volume of capacity that there is in the market. The growth in world container volumes, whilst there has been steady growth, even during the downturn of 2009, that was a very minor blip. So we've seen quite a growth in container volumes, but that has not kept pace with the capacity expansion. The goods that we're shipping, of which those might be some, but increasingly the number and type of goods that are being containerized is growing and is changing. So there is a growth in capacity, even in markets where there's a static overall position in volumes of cargo being moved. Because the fixed costs of running a ship are so high, it's very important for shipping lines to maximize utilization. So every shipping line is scrapping around for the cargo that is available, and when you have overcapacity in the market, as we do, and as I say, an increasing overcapacity, then you get fierce competition for cargo, and the natural tendency is for freight rates to decline. So that is one of the main reasons why, if you look in the press, you'll find that the majority of container shipping lines are losing money and have been pretty consistently for the last 5 years. So what does that mean? It means that my boss is looking at me going, well, we can't do much about the freight rates because the market is dictating those. There is overcapacity in the market. We can only charge what the market will take. So we have to focus on cost reduction, which can be quite a depressing state of affairs. However much you do, it seems it's not enough, because the minute you get some cost reduction, then you'll find that the freight rates have moved down even further. So it's a very, very competitive market. Are you feeling sorry for me yet? We shall find out. So there are two ways that you can focus on delivering costs in the main in the world of shipping. One is by straightforward direct cost reduction, and I'm sure we'll hear from some other partners in the supply chain just how much we've been bashing them over the heads in order to reduce the costs, whether that's at the port, whether that's trains, trucks, whatever. We are heavily pressured into having to do that. We would love to pay them all more, but it's not going to happen in the environment we're in. And the second way of doing it is the bit that we can sort of help ourselves, which is that we can get economies of scale. So you obviously have a number of fixed costs, such as fuel, pilotage, tugs, Suez Canal dues, light dues, all of these sort of different costs. And the more containers that you can spread those fixed costs per voyage over, the better. So what that leads to is the strange phenomenon that shipping lines are losing millions and millions of dollars every year, and yet they carry on building bigger and bigger ships that only fuels the problem of overcapacity in the market. Completely illogical, except it's also logical. It's almost like a game of it's almost like a game of poker. If once you're in, you've got a choice. You've got all these huge, expensive fixed assets. And you can throw your chips in and lose all of the value of those. Or you can carry on investing in bigger and bigger ships, which have the economies of scale to allow you to compete. Because if your competitor can sell his space on a particular route for, or if the cost of that competitor is $100 less, then clearly he can be making money at a point when you're losing money. So it is a game of building bigger and bigger in order to reduce the unit cost on a ship's vessel. Now, of course, the flaw in that argument is it only works if your ships are full. So ships are increasingly over the years, I think if you look back in time here into the 1980s, when we had the gargantuan 3,000 TEU ships, which would just about pass as feeder ships these days, at that time, I think the economics were that people were building ships and expecting to fill them about 75%. Now we're in the situation where the mega vessels are built and the whole financing of them is justified on trying to fill them somewhere at 95% plus. So you can see some sort of flaws in that approach. But equally, if you stop and think about it, what else would you do if you were a shipping line and you can see your competitors moving and building bigger ships? You really have to be in that game. So you can see the growth in ships in the different years. So 2013, the largest ships around were Maersk's Triple-E vessels, which were 18,000 TEU. And a number of shipping lines, including MOL, are now building 20,000 TEU ships. And if you believe what you read in the press, technically it would be very, very easy to move to a 25,000 TEU ship without too much technical modification. So are we at the limit of it? Well, I would hesitate to ask, because in any era that is shown on that chart, everyone would have thought, here we are at the limit, these are as big as they're going to get, and then they get bigger still. So there must, I guess, be a limit of some sort, but maybe that limit starts to come in other places within the supply chain. Because if we have a look at some of the local impacts and the impacts of these bigger and bigger ships, you can start to see where that would be the case. So the growth in the development of larger ships affects the supply chain, both upstream and downstream of the shipping component. Firstly, obviously, if you've got more capacity, you don't need so many ships to carry the same amount of volume. So if there isn't that volume growth, the ships aren't deployed. So what you end up with is a reduction in the number of port calls and the same volume delivered by by the same number of calls. So what that leads to is less and less direct services because there are less and less ports that can cope with these large ships, and a growth in feeder volumes as well. So suddenly, within this supply chain, the importance of doing transshipment efficiently and cost-effectively, and it's a notorious area where things can go wrong, becomes important. So you're getting a subtle shift that it wasn't designed by the shipping lines, but it's a knock-on impact of what they are doing in order to try and make the numbers add up economically for themselves. Obviously, if you've got a bigger ship arriving in a port where maybe it's discharging 5,000 TEU, 5,000 containers, where previously the smaller ships would only have discharged 2,000, you suddenly got a massive peak that you didn't have before in containers. That's got to be handled by the port, so the ports need to think about how they handle those containers. But then, as you start to think about where do all these containers go, as consumers, we're always wanting everything in the shops, and we've heard about stock levels and just-in-time management. We're all wanting it immediately. And so that is fed through to what the people shipping the cargo are wanting. So all of them want their container the very next day after it's arrived in port. Now, whereas that might have been possible when you only had 2,000 containers to deal with, when you've got 5,000, it's simply impossible. There isn't the capacity in the market of haulage, of rail freight. There isn't the capacity in the ports to move the containers through quickly enough. So that starts to imply that actually you need to start to adjust your thinking and expectations about how quickly you can get containers off a ship. And it's remarkable that ships can spend 3-4 weeks getting all the way, say, from Asia to the UK, and yet suddenly it's critical that it's in the warehouse 12 hours later in a 15-minute delivery slot. So it's like cogs of a wheel, and container shipping, I think, is the big cog that's moving very, very slowly. And then increasingly, as you get down, eventually to the consumer, so I'm sorry, we're all to blame for this, we're the little cogs that are going around like we want it now, and we want the size we want, and we want it to be in the shop now. And by the way, we want it to be as absolutely as cheap as possible. So what I'm trying to say is you, and indeed I, am responsible for the terrible economic state of the world of container shipping, because it's us that are driving this whole cycle that you can see going through the supply chain. Just one final point on the bottom. Obviously, when things go wrong, it goes wrong in a much bigger way, the bigger the ship that you've got that you're dealing with. So we hear a lot about port congestion, and whether that's the port's fault or whether that's the shipping line's fault. Schedule reliability has gone to pot. Actually, in the last month, it's hit a new high of actually being efficient, but that may or may not be luck. Shipping lines are aware we have to work on this, because if you're off slot and you're arriving with a large ship in a port, then you can cause chaos and knock-on chaos, and simply the capacity isn't there to cope with that. So we, and indeed customers, our customers, need to think about the logistics chain in a different way, and expectations perhaps need to change and to be managed. So that's bigger ships. As I mentioned, cost of fuel is one of the main direct impacts as well. And up to 2014, of course, fuel costs were rising sharply. We've all enjoyed the lower cost of fuel at the pumps, and that's also reflected in the bunkers that you purchase for ships. So in the last year, there has been a dramatic and unexpected fall, which ironically has also then fueled a further crash in freight rates, because, of course, shippers are expecting you to pass some of this cost through to them. But what it has meant is that freight rates generally on the global scale are now at the lowest level they have ever been. Shipping lines are making a loss, but they would be making even more of a loss if it wasn't for the low price of fuel. Now, what we are seeing, though, is a hangover from that point of high fuel, where the shipping line reaction was to go for slow steaming. So by slowing down the ships, you would burn less fuel. And then also to work to create alliances with other shipping lines so that you can get some efficiencies in the network. And just very, very quickly on both of those, I think this points are fairly obvious. But here was a chart that I stole off the internet. Sorry, not to acknowledge where it's come from. But it's a little bit old now. It's actually only a couple of years old. But you'll see what it shows here is the speed of the ship along the bottom and the fuel consumption in tons. So the faster that the ship goes, the more fuel that you burn. And then the different lines are the different sizes of ship. Now, you can tell it's 2 years old, because the largest ship it goes for it says 10,000 plus, but at that time they were 12,000 TEU ships we were talking about. And the lowest speed that it goes down to is 17 knots. At the time that this was written, a typical speed for a ship coming from Asia would have been 22, 23 knots. Now, a ship coming from Asia will go at 18 knots, and if for some reason it's really off schedule and we want to speed it up, we might get up to about 20 knots. But if you look at those ships going back, where the pressure is, the cargo is perhaps less time sensitive and it's viewed very much as the return leg, the graph doesn't even describe it. We now, after extra slow steaming, have got super slow steaming, which is something like the M25, nothing moves. The speeds that we're looking at there are about 15 knots, and the fastest we will go eastbound to Asia now would be about 18 knots. So that was a reaction. That was a reaction to the high cost of fuel, and it directly saved costs of fuel. But since the prices have come down, slow steaming, it seems, is now structurally ingrained, because obviously you can still get the cost advantages whatever the price of fuel. Maybe they're just slightly less. But equally, there are environmental advantages to this as well. So increasingly, this is part of the environmental footprint, and the faster you go, the more fuel you burn, and the worse it is for the environment. So I think slow steaming is here to stay, almost irrespective of the fuel price. It's not quite as simple as that. There is a sort of a balance to be struck between speed and demand and what customers are willing to pay, but we basically find that customers will not pay for speed. So I think slow steaming is here to stay. It also has the effect of absorbing overcapacity, because the slower you go, obviously to then maintain a weekly schedule, you need more vessels in your service to cope with that. So it is a way of absorbing some of this extra capacity that has come into the market, and you may now have 10 vessels on a Far East service, for example, where previously you would have had 8 to provide the same weekly service. So that's the sort of impact that fuel prices are having. Slow steaming, it's a factor of the market. One of the slides earlier pointed, it might have been one of yours, said something about speed being important. Shipping lines, because of all this economic argument and trying to make money out of this, are doing exactly the opposite of what you might think the market demand would be. They're going slower and slower. The other thing we're doing is forming alliances. This is the alliance that MOL is part of, which is called the G6 Alliance. What it does is it allows you to share capacity. So this is an operating, not a commercial, not a sales alliance. So it's purely operational. And what we do is by combining vessels with other people, you don't have to build so many vessels. It means that you can expand your service in a sort of smooth style rather than a lumpy style. So if you were in the business on your own and you introduce a whole load of new ships, obviously you would then have to fill all those ships. If you're in an alliance, you only have to, in this case, fill 1/6 of those new ships. So it allows a reduction in fleet size for individual shipping lines. It also then frees up some ships that allows you to put more economic ships on other services. So all of those things have brought substantial benefits financially to shipping lines over the last few years, which is another reason that is supporting, if you like, or driving lower freight rates. But it's all very much from the cost side that it's being driven. Mergers and acquisitions, somebody ought to have gone bust in the world of container shipping. Someone big ought to have gone bust in the last few years, but it hasn't for a variety of reasons. Maybe because alliances work and help prop things up, but also there are a lot of sort of vested national interests. So a number of shipping lines are owned by or have government interests in them, or governments want to see a national shipping line, so they will prop them up to some extent. So let me now just bring all of this together before I, let's say, leave you with a couple of other points. What do we know about the future? What is it going to look like from a shipping line perspective? What might that mean? The world of container shipping is going to remain extremely competitive. That's very, very clear. If you like, the good old days are gone from a container shipping point of view. Potential economies of scale mean that more and more larger ships will be built despite the slow growth in demand. There is no sign of that trend slowing down or reversing at the moment. This will put pressure on freight rates, making cost reduction even more important for shipping lines. The pressure will be on ports to develop the capacity to handle these new and larger vessels at the same time as reducing costs, because we're pressing them to reduce their costs. So we're pushing some of that pressure down the supply chain. And likewise, the landside operations, whether that's trucking, transport, local depot arrangements, all need to be redesigned to handle the change in volume patterns that come with these larger ships' calls. And then finally, in terms of the challenge, customer expectations need to be rethought, or they need to think through what it is that is going to work for them, and what's acceptable and what they can expect. Now, that's easy to say. You could say, well, why can't we come up with some solutions that mean that the customers can maintain their expectations? And that, of course, is the direction it's going. And one of the ways that we can help with this is the point that was made earlier, which is to apply IT in a thought-through way. And increasingly, it will become important not just to measure and control performance within the supply chain, but most importantly for customers, it will tell them where their cargo is on a real-time type of basis. I think one of the big challenges is to get that sort of linking up between what's on the water, what the port can expect, what happens when things are going wrong, so that you can adjust your expectations and change all of those little elements. All of those truck bookings need to be rebooked. How much of that can we automate? How much can we use IT to get that communication working better? And what I've discovered with customers is if you just turn up late, they tend to be annoyed. They tend to be not quite so annoyed if you tell them you're going to turn up late and then stick to what you're going to do. So again, IT has a big role to play in terms of communications with customers and to manage expectations in that respect. And one-time data input, admin cost savings, automatic approval, electronic invoicing, we've already touched on that, and I agree entirely. That's another way that IT is going to help. And then this morning we heard a slightly, you might think, cynical view, but I also happen to think it's realistic. At the end of the day, the environmental agenda is not really going to take off unless there is an economic impact, whether that's in terms of taxes or charges for not complying. But nonetheless, what's going on in the container shipping side does have environmental implications. The bigger ships and the more efficient designs do have that happy environmental impact of reducing the impact per container or per ton of cargo. On the other hand, as I say, if you're going to control these things, I think there needs to be financial penalties involved in not doing the right thing. So low emission zones is a feature around the European coastline and other parts of the world. So that adds to the costs, but also it makes lines think innovatively. So maybe there'll be different fuel technologies, different things that we do to engines that we wouldn't otherwise do. So again, those things are driving change in the industry. And as we heard, for whatever reason, customers are increasingly demanding that shipping lines and other parts of the supply chain take an environmentally responsible view. So that in itself will drive what we do, because that will be part of the buying criteria. So plenty of thoughts there, but hopefully that explains to you a little bit about some of what you might consider as slightly strange behavior from shipping lines. It all makes perfect sense.